Hi everyone. I should probably start out by saying that I'm not Chris Coughlin. So I'm the first speaker. I'm also the chair of this first session. So to kick off our symposium and to launch our new centre, we've put together what I think will be a really interesting set of provocative talks leading up to lunchtime today. The title of the session, which I'll chair until the coffee break, is The Great Barrier Reef in Danger. It's significant, I think, that we didn't put a question mark after that phrase. It's actually a statement of fact. So I'm going to kick this off, and I hope you'll get some sort of a flavour from my talk about the new emphasis in our revitalised centre on the human dimension and the policy issues and the governance issues around the future management of coral reefs here in Australia, but also elsewhere around the tropical world. So the title of my talk is up there on the screen. I'll be talking about shifting baselines. Now, shifting baselines is a concept which is quite familiar now to ecologists, but I'm also going to talk about shifting baselines in how we perceive not just ecosystems, but also the human activities that impact on those ecosystems, and most importantly, shifts in governance that have been occurring in how we govern and manage the Great Barrier Reef over the last 40 years or so. So I hope you'll get a flavour for this new emphasis in multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research that we'll be undertaking over the next 7 years. So I'll talk today about shifts and trajectories in the drivers of change. Some people call these the threats or the human impacts. I find those terms a little bit too value-laden, so I'm going to refer to them a little bit more neutrally as simply drivers of change. We can make a value judgment as to whether that's a good change or a bad change. I'll talk only very briefly about shifts in ecosystems because people like Helene Marsh and Jamie Oliver from Ames will talk about that later on this morning in much more detail. I'm going to emphasize shifts in governance of the Great Barrier Reef for most of my talk. And I'll finish up by addressing this really critical issue of how can governance of the Great Barrier Reef be improved, because it needs to be improved. So I'll start by looking at trajectories in drivers. Now, this is a very simple exercise that anyone can do with Google. You can get data on, say, the human population of Queensland or the amount of fertilizer that's being used in the catchment. So let me explain this graph briefly. I don't appear to have a pointer. So the y-axis here is scaled from 0 to 10, 10 being the maximum level of each of these drivers or proxies of drivers over the last century or so, and the x-axis is time from about 1900 up to the present day. So the red dots are the population of Queensland, which is growing exponentially. It's expected, the number of people in the catchment of the Great Barrier Reef is expected to double over the next 20 to 25 years. The green squares are the number of recreational boat licenses in the catchment of the Great Barrier Reef. That's a proxy for fishing pressure, recreational fishing. The purple diamonds are a fertilizer application, which is growing and growing and growing. The blue squares are the amount of sugarcane which is being harvested in the catchment, and again, it's growing exponentially. There's a bit of a dip in recent years. That was because of the flooding, but again, there are plans to expand sugarcane growing in the catchment of the Great Barrier Reef. The one that I think is really interesting is the yellow diamond. That's coal extraction and export from Queensland. And that's been doubling since about 1970 every decade, and it's set to increase threefold or so over the next 25 years. And that has very important implications for Australia's carbon footprint and for the infrastructure that is being planned and for activities like dredging and dumping of dredge spoil within the Barrier Reef Marine Park, which is, of course, of great concern to UNESCO, which is the world body which is now considering putting the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area on their endangered list, which would be a dreadful thing to happen to Australia's reputation, global reputation in coral reef management. So we all need to take that incredibly seriously. So the 2 points I want to make with this graph is that the drivers are escalating, the human pressures, if you like, are growing and growing and growing, and also the diversity of those drivers and the interactions between them are also becoming much more complex, with new drivers like coal dredging appearing in much more recent times. That's all I'm going to say about shifts in drivers. I also just want to make one point, and that is what's been happening to those drivers in recent years. So I've blanked out here the early part of those trajectories to focus just on the right-hand side of that graph, which is what's been happening to those trajectories since the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park was established. There's an argument in the press in recent months that ports have been there for 150 years, that dredging has been a fact of life on the Great Barrier Reef forever, and there's no evidence that it has ever caused any damage. I think that's a very false argument, and if you look at that trajectory for coal extraction, the yellow diamonds, you can see that the huge expansion of coals is a completely modern phenomenon and completely unprecedented as a management challenge for the Great Barrier Reef. I'm not going to talk very much at all. I have one slide, this one, on the response of the Barrier Reef ecosystem to these escalating drivers. I'm going to leave that to other people to talk about in much more detail later on this morning. I'll just summarize it. So people like Helene Marsh have documented the decline in megafauna, things like dugongs and turtles, which are greatly depleted, and sharks. People have also documented very dramatic declines in coastal seagrasses and in coral. So Jamie will no doubt talk about the 50% decline in coral cover on the Great Barrier Reef in recent decades. As a consequence of fishing pressure, we've seen depletion of sharks. Almost all of the reef fish which are fished on the Great Barrier Reef are predators. So the trophic structure of food webs has been quite dramatically changed. There are fewer corals, there's more seaweed. We're dealing with quite an altered ecosystem in most parts of the Great Barrier Reef. And finally, we're seeing more and more bleaching due to global warming. We're seeing an increased prevalence of coral disease, and Betty Willis will talk about this. And we're now seeing the fourth major outbreak of crown of thorns starfish unfolding. So the Great Barrier Reef ecologically is declining. That is a fact, and that is a major challenge to how we manage and govern the Great Barrier Reef. So I now want to switch to focus on governance, and that will be the main part of my talk that I want to finish with. So I'm going to talk about shifting governance. Now, what do I mean by governance? To most people like me with a biological training, when we think of governance, we normally associate that with formal governance, which is governments, and with management agencies like the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. But for people who study governance, social scientists, people who look at institutional dynamics, governance is how social actors or players or stakeholders, if you like, share power and make decisions. It's how a society works. And those social actors include the formal elements, governments and agencies and NGOs, but also more informal ones. The role of the media, for instance, in denying climate change in Australia is very important in how CO2 emissions are governed. And of course, the general public and scientists play major roles in how shifts in governance take place. So governance can be formal or informal. It can be top-down, driven by government decree, or it can be bottom-up by people power, a groundswell of public opinion that forces governments to act, or more typically, it can be all of the above. So I want to look today at 4 examples of governance of the Great Barrier Reef and the region surrounding it in action. I'm going to look at 4 examples. The first is the establishment of the marine park way back in 1976. The second is the recent rezoning 10 years ago, led by Virginia Chadwick, who was then the leader of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. And the third and fourth are contemporary governance shifts in relation to the Coral Sea and the management of coastal development in Queensland. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn, beginning with the establishment of the marine park. The marine park was established by a bottom-up concern from the Australian public about how the Great Barrier Reef was travelling. There was huge concerns after the first two outbreaks of crown of thorns. There was also public concern about proposals from the state of Queensland to mine the reef and to drill it for oil and potential gas reserves. The Commonwealth Government stepped into the fray and established the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority under the terms of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act of 1975. Now, most of the people in this room, including all of our graduate students and most of our postdocs, weren't born then. So I just want to make that statement to emphasize how visionary and novel this approach was. Somebody very smart, in combination with public opinion, established a custom-designed de novo institution that was built for purpose, and it was built at the appropriate scale. So the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority was in charge of just about everything that takes place within the boundaries shown here in red. And the area of real estate that they were in charge of is the area of Italy. This was an incredibly creative thing to do. It was both bottom-up and top-down, and there was a large element of scientific information which was harnessed to make this initial transformation and in governance a reality. If we fast forward now to 2004, almost 10 years ago to the day, the Great Barrier Reef rezoning took place. This, I believe, was another triumph of governance. Again, it had elements of top-down and bottom-up, and a key issue here was the leadership that Gebrumpa showed. Gebrumpa led this show. They harnessed public opinion. They engaged in an unprecedented level with the scientific community. They consulted with just about everyone. They had 1,000 public meetings. They received 31,000 written submissions, and they responded to those written submissions. And this is widely regarded now as best practice. And indeed, Gebrumpa won lots of international awards for the way they went about their core business in rezoning the Great Barrier Reef. Excuse me. My third example is not such a happy one. I'll get to that in a moment. The rezoning is demonstrably effective, and since the rezoning has occurred, many people in this room have been looking at the efficacy of that rezoning. So this is just one example. Very briefly, the colors here refer to the different zones. So pink is no-go or no entry zones. Green is no fishing zones. You can enter, but you're not allowed to fish. Yellow, you can fish recreationally, but not commercially. And blue is the most lax of the four zones that are shown here. If you measure fish biomass or density, or in this case, the number of sharks in those different zones, you get this classic step of stairs effect, which shows that as you go from the most stringent zones, the pink ones, to the more lax ones, from right to left, you get this sequential increase or decrease in fish, depending on which direction you're going, that show that zoning works. Unfortunately, both state and Commonwealth governments in recent times have been backing away from zones, and I think it's important for the scientific community to get the message out very straight. There's no controversy about whether zones work or not. Clearly, they do. At least they do in terms of protecting targeted species. I want to make one other point with this graph while I've got it up, and that relates to one shortcoming of the rezoning, and that is it wasn't accompanied by sufficient resources to police and enforce the new zoning. So if you look at the biomass here of sharks from these two studies, you'll see that there's quite a big disparity, particularly in the bottom one, between the number of sharks in pink zones and in green zones. They should be the same because they are both no fishing zones. The difference is if you're caught inside a pink zone, you're going to get in trouble legally, whereas you can be in a green zone. You're allowed to be there. You just have to hide your fishing gear when the plane or the patrol boat goes past, or fish at night. So this is clear evidence of poaching, which is occurring at a very wide scale within the marine park today, and that is an issue which is ongoing and which needs to be fixed. So to summarize all of that, basically the rezoning was best practice. Unfortunately, the rezoning doesn't deal with some important issues. Now, I'm not meaning to infer that zoning is the only management tool used by Gabrumpa, and John Day will talk about that in some more detail. But I do want to make the point that zoning doesn't cope with climate change, and zoning doesn't cope with the impacts of dredging and runoff from land. This is an aerial photograph showing runoff from one of the rivers in the catchment, and you can see, and Brody will talk about this in his talk. You can see the very substantial impact of how a very altered catchment is exporting sediment and nutrients, and now we've got the additional problem of massive amounts of dredge spoil dumping from the industrialization of the coast of Queensland. And finally, zoning doesn't deal with crown of thorns starfish, and other people in this meeting will talk about the link between outbreaks of crown of thorns starfish and added nutrients from land-based activities. So those are the first two examples, and I would join most people in labeling those astonishing successes where Gabrumpa showed real leadership in improving the governance of the Great Barrier Reef. I now want to move on to the last two examples. The first one is coastal development, the huge expansion of ports along the coast of Queensland. They haven't been there for 150 years, just sitting there benignly. They are now exploding in a completely unprecedented way. We're also seeing permits being approved for the development of new mega resorts on the Keppel Islands, and also the proposal for a huge mega resort in Cairns. This governance shift is very much top-down. No one is asking the general public or the broad science community what they think of this shift in governance. So this is an example here of a report issued by the state of Queensland on how they were going to triple the amount of export of coal over the next 20 years or so. No one's been asked whether that's a good idea or not. So they went through a sort of sham public consultation process where the final report looks almost exactly the same as the report for consultation. So this is being forged ahead without really any science, and certainly without any consensus from the general public. The industry is arguing that there's no evidence for any impact of dredging on the Great Barrier Reef. But if you just look at these pictures, you can see that there's a big issue with dredge spoil dumping, with the dispersal of sediments. It doesn't just settle where you dump it. It's widely dispersed, particularly during cyclones. Ship grounding is another issue. And later on in the symposium, we'll hear a talk delivered by one of our students, Joe Pollock. Joe's been working with Betty Willis and colleagues at Ames, and they have definitive evidence of the impact of dredging on the reef, which you'll hear later on in the symposium. So moving now to, I would describe this as a governance fiasco. Moving now to the final example, and that's the recent national scale rezoning, which has taken place over the last decade or so following the initial rezoning in 2004 of the Great Barrier Reef. So this is the final outcome, and it shows a portion of the coast around Australia in the Barrier Reef region. And you can see there the outline of the Coral Sea Marine Park, which is enormous. You can also see the placement of the green zone, the no-take zone, on the outer part of the Coral Sea. Now, this governance shift was also very top-down. It was driven by Canberra rather than by the science community or by agencies who have experience in this, like Gabrumpa. I wrote during the public consultation phase a critique of the draft plan along with Hugh Possingham, and we got 350 of our science colleagues to agree to this consensus statement from the science community. And the major point we made was that the green zone is in the wrong place, and that this was in fact a missed opportunity to install a new buffer zone, to put the green zone on the outer edge of the boundary with the Great Barrier Reef to improve governance of the Great Barrier Reef. The government ignored that suggestion, and so the new zoning was passed by both houses of Parliament just before the last election. Since the last election, absolutely nothing has happened. So if you go to the Department of the Environment's website today, you'll see that map and this notice which says that until a management plan comes into effect, there's no change. So we have a nice map, but you can still do what you always did. So we have the ridiculous situation where we have the second biggest no-take green zone where fishing is prohibited in the world, where you can go fishing. So Australia has effectively created the world's largest system of paper parks, at least so far, until the government puts these management plans into operation, which they show no sign of doing. So this, again, is a top-down system. There was a sort of mock consultation process. The scientific community was given the fairly clear message that their interference wasn't welcome. And I think the outcome, in this case again, is a failure of governance. So what can we learn from these four different examples? So I want to finish up the talk very quickly by looking at these four examples as a historical shift in the way that the Barrier Reef and the Barrier Reef region are governed. It's basically what I'm calling a shifting baseline in how we govern and manage the reef. If we go back to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act of 1975, the preamble to that act has some very critical language, which I want to explain to you. It states that the main objective of the act is to provide for the long-term protection and conservation of the Great Barrier Reef region, right? Remember those words, protection and region. It's not bits of the Great Barrier Reef. It's not the southern bit versus the northern bit, the inshore versus the offshore. It's the whole kit and caboodle. And John Day will talk about the World Heritage issue of integrity, which is about the wholeness of the Great Barrier Reef and whether it is complete. Increasingly, we're hearing politicians talk about the good bits and the bad bits, and how we can sort of let the bad bits slide so long as we look after enough of the good bits somewhere within the World Heritage Area. And that's completely anathema to the sentiments of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act. The Act goes on to say that so far as consistent with protection, we can do these other things. But the big proviso is we must protect the Great Barrier Reef. And I believe that sentiment has changed very subtly and gradually over the last few years. So the shift is a switch from an emphasis on protection, as exemplified by the Act, to multiple use, and a switch from protecting biodiversity to maximizing ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services is a dangerous term because among the ecosystem services that the reef provides is fishing, and the way to maximize the ecosystem services from fishing is to remove all the fish. It also provides the ecosystem service of diluting pollution and absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere so that the land doesn't warm up so much. So ecosystem services is just another way of looking at human impacts. So maximizing ecosystem services as a governance goal, I think, is complete folly, and it's contrary to the goal of protection. We've also seen a switch, as I mentioned, from dealing with the region as a whole and a focus on the outstanding universal value of integrity to maintaining bits of the reef so that the whole thing doesn't decline. And these recent governance shifts, the last two that I mentioned, are much more top-down. They're much less science-driven than before, and they're much less open to public opinion. And I believe that needs to change. And finally, a big major shift in the way governance is undertaken in Australia is the issue of offsets. And here the sentiment is that major developments are allowed to proceed even if they cause unavoidable damage, providing that they do something good for the environment somewhere else. And to my mind, offsets are simply a license for environmental vandalism. So my last slide is, how could governance of the Great Barrier Reef be improved? And I've just got a couple of points here to finish up with. I think we need to reinstate the emphasis on protection of the Great Barrier Reef. We need to ban dredge dumping within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and adjoining it, and we need to ban new coal mines and switch to cleaner energy as soon as possible. We need to reform the way environmental impact assessments are done, and people like Hugh Possingham and Bob Pressey will talk about that a bit more. We need to abandon offsets as a flawed policy in relation to governance of the Great Barrier Reef. We need to empower Gabrumpa, or perhaps I should say re-empower Gabrumpa. Gabrumpa has shown leadership in the past. In recent times, it's become a political football. The key challenge, I think, is to re-empower Gabrumpa and to redesign it so that it's once again fit for purpose. The vision of establishing Gabrumpa in 1976 has been diluted because now the major drivers of change occur outside the box of the marine park. We're dealing now with climate change, with terrestrial runoff, and with port development and mega resorts, that the Great Barrier Reef has insufficient authority to govern and to manage, and that needs to change. And finally, we need to urgently develop a 50-year plan for how the Great Barrier Reef catchment is used. We need to think the way we have been thinking in Australia about the Murray-Darling Basin. What is the best configuration of land use in the catchment of the Great Barrier Reef? We need to put some thought into that and some resources into that. And that is not likely to happen through government leadership, at least not right now. What I think it may happen is through bottom-up, through a groundswell of public opinion that is informed by scientific research. And I think that is a major challenge for our new centre. Thank you very much.